that they want clarified? Any parts of the pointers that don't make sense?
Yeah, Roger, yesterday you mentioned something that seemed to crack into a misunderstanding that I had, and it would be lovely if you can talk more about it. It's on the fact that how we perceive love, and that it's also a form of pleasure that we actually look for in love.
Mm.
Can you help clarify this more and talk a little bit more about it?
Yeah, great. Good. So one of the key principles of what's being pointed at here is that there is an identity in place that is being referred to as the belief in personal doership. And that belief in personal in doership is a set of beliefs that relates and reacts to life as it unfolds. And core to that belief, there's basically two halves of the belief. The belief in personal doership half, which says I am the doer and the other is the doer of everything that happens through me and everything that happens through them. And so then we relate to the movement of the body, the thinking of the body, the feelings of the body, as if they are my doing, that I'm completely responsible on all levels for what I feel and what I think and how I act. And then we project the same understanding on what the other is. The second half of this belief in personal doership is attachment to outcomes, meaning that there is a deep ingrained belief that says my happiness, my completeness is dependent on outcomes and pleasure. Now this, when I talk about this belief in personal doership, it can sound like it's just something we've picked up, a belief that there is life on Mars or there isn't life on Mars. But this particular set of beliefs is something far, far deeper than any other belief that we have. So much so that it doesn't feel at all like a belief. It feels like who I am. Because at the core of the belief is included this I am the doer. I need pleasure in order to be complete. And this belief system has been set in place because of the experience of life. From when we were born, the experience started to become more and more an experience of I am this. So when we were first born, the experience I am this wasn't present. And over the course of the first 2.5 or 3 years, that sense of being this, which is the experience, changes from being a much less personal experience that the baby has, and we can sort of observe the baby's awareness of what's around it, and there isn't any relationship back to the body as being what it is. And over time, that experience changes for the baby and the toddler, until such time as the feeling I am this is set in. And so from that feeling I am this comes the belief I am this. And that belief is reinforced moment after moment for our whole life. So it becomes so deeply ingrained that it's not registered as a belief. It's not seen as a belief because the experience is taken to be absolutely real. The experience is I am this. And so our assessment generally is that if the experience is there, it must be true. That if the experience I am this is there, then I have to be this. So the belief gets deeper and deeper and deeper and creates an identity. And the identity, as I was just saying, is I am the doer, the other is the doer, and I need pleasure and outcomes in order to be complete. That's what this identity tells us. That's the feeling that comes from. It's not just a belief, it's a belief that translates then into a feeling. And that feeling is what drives us through life. It's that feeling that drives us to seek something, to seek in general. But we find that seeking is through outcomes, through pleasure. So we spend our whole life seeking the perfect relationship, seeking the perfect lifestyle environment, basically. The circumstance that this feeling tells us will satisfy us. And deepest down at the bottom of this belief is the belief that I need love in order to be complete. And so in general terms, it's I need pleasure in order to be complete. And what's being expanded on here is that actually at the base of this I need pleasure, the ultimate or the deepest attachment to pleasure is the attachment to the pleasure of love. And often we don't relate to love as pleasure, because love is obviously, we just say love is so much more noble than just pleasure. We tend to think of pleasure as material pleasure. In the scope of these sharings, pleasure is much broader than just material pleasure. Pleasure is anything that happens in the flow of life, moment after moment after moment. And whatever happens in the flow of life is either pleasure or pain. There is physical pleasure and pain, financial pleasure and pain, emotional pleasure and pain, and love you can put under a combination of physical and feeling and emotions. And if we can start looking at life this way, seeing that the flow of life in each moment is always either pleasure or pain, depending on our biological preferences. And if we can start to see that, wow, could it be that love is actually pleasure or pain, depending on the circumstance. And this doesn't diminish the feeling of love, describing it as pleasure or pain. It's still the same intense and complex feeling, very beautiful. What we're doing is we're just categorizing it correctly now, saying this very complex, beautiful feeling of love that can happen is actually part of the flow of life, pleasure or pain. And our relationship to that flow of life is usually that I need the flow of life to be a certain way, which then means we have a relationship to love. I need it to be there, which means we end up seeking for love. And the suggestion is that seeking for love is as misguided as seeking for money, seeking for a new job or a better place to live in. Now, when I say misguided, there's nothing wrong with trying to improve our life situation. That's fine. But when we mistake our life situation and improving our life situation for our completeness, that's where the error comes in. And that's generally what we're doing. We're trying to improve our life situation because there's a feeling inside of incompleteness. And so the improving our life situation is coming from this feeling of incompleteness that says once you improve your life situation, then you won't feel incomplete anymore. And what we have enough experience of, hopefully, is to recognize that from time to time I get the improved circumstance that I'm hoping for, I get the pleasure that I'm looking for, and yet it doesn't get rid of the uncomfortable feeling inside. And so this is one of the pointers that says your happiness, human happiness, will never be found in circumstance, will never be found in the flow of life, will never be found in pleasure or pain, which is what the flow of life is. And so really when we're talking about love specifically, it's saying your happiness will never be found in love. It will never be found in the pleasure or the circumstance of love. And when we look at our behavior and our movement, just objectively, without being self-critical, we can see that that movement suggests that there is very much a belief deep inside that says my happiness will be found in love. So many people are waiting for their soulmate, and with the idea that once my soulmate comes into my life, then everything will be okay. And from time to time, someone comes into their life, and invariably it doesn't fix this deep uncomfortableness with oneself. And then the thought is, oh, well, maybe they're not my soulmate. I'll wait for the real soulmate to come along. And we could keep perpetuating this idea forever. And what if a soulmate isn't the solution? The feeling inside says it is. The feeling inside comes from this belief, I am the doer, the other is the doer, and I need circumstance, pleasure to be complete. That's an error. That's a mistake of who we are. And so the feeling that stems out of it, the thing that says, when you get this, everything will be okay, is also an error. But it doesn't feel like an error. It feels absolutely real. It feels like this is what I have to trust and follow, this feeling that's telling me to go down this path of seeking my happiness in the future, seeking my happiness out there. So if we start understanding what the pointers are saying, they're effectively countering the inaccurate beliefs and movements that are in the system. So the pointer is saying, our happiness will never be found in love. And so then we observe when we are obsessed and moving towards finding love, feeling devastated when it isn't delivered, feeling like something is absolutely missing when we're not in a certain relationship. Then awareness can land on this and say, wow, this must be coming from a belief that my happiness is to be found in love. So then the concept starts to weaken the belief. At least it brings in an investigation. Because if we don't have an opposing concept to what is currently in place, then we'll keep assuming that this is absolutely true. Once an opposing concept comes into place, we then have to wonder, okay, so which one is true? And when we go into that process of finding out which one is true, then the mistakes, the errors, under enough scrutiny will fall away. So if you scrutinize an error for long enough, it will show up as being an error. And one of the ways that we dissolve these beliefs, or actually we don't dissolve it, one of the ways life dissolves the belief is by altering the habits that stem from the beliefs. So either we can change the belief and that will change the habit. Rather, I'll speak in more accurate terms, either the belief can get changed by life and then that will alter the habit, or the same way, because the habit and the belief is interconnected. They're actually two ends of the one thing. We can start altering the habit and that will change the belief. So if we find ourselves continually moving throughout the day in a way that supports this belief, and we realize that this movement of looking, let's say, and waiting for love, if we can see an expression, a habit that we can adjust or alter, then by altering that habit, by default, the ingrained belief is going to start changing. Whereas if nothing changes, the habit of how we move through life remains the same. That's because the belief is how it is. And if nothing changes, it keeps functioning in the same way. So why don't we need love? Why don't we need pleasure in order to be complete? This is an important part of the question. And the reason is that our happiness is actually to be found inside. What that means is that what we happen to be in essence, what the human being happens to be in essence, is something very unique. It just so happens to be that what we are in essence is the answer to our problem of seeking fullness and completeness. Our essence is already complete and full. So really we don't need to go anywhere or do anything. All of the seeking that happens in time and can be quite extensive eventually brings us round to the realization there's nowhere to go, there's nothing to do, because who I am is actually the solution. And this realization happens once awareness lands on that which it hasn't landed on for our whole lifetime. Because the feeling that has arisen says my answer is, the feeling says something is missing. That feeling comes from the false idea of who we are. You can imagine if we have a false idea of who we are, meaning we don't know ourselves, that's going to create an uncomfortable feeling. And so from that error of not knowing ourselves, that uncomfortable feeling, there is the seeking outwards. And so for our whole life, awareness has been focusing on that is outside. And after this seeking process happens for sometimes a very long time, the whole process is about continually breaking down the idea that we need to look out there, until such time as glimpses and realizations start happening about who we really are. So experientially, we start feeling, oh, wow, when certain thinking patterns die down, I find myself resting and feeling content. Resting and feeling like actually nothing needs to change as drastically as I previously thought. So this is really a journey of dissolving those false beliefs that act as a veil to our true nature. And as that veil is removed, we tend to recognize what we are and rest in being, meaning we get to be what we are. And then we find that the essence of the human being doesn't need anything. So then the question of I need love, the thought I need love, falls away. It's not a valid thought anymore because the feeling has changed radically. So this is not to say anyone's doing anything wrong. These are just explanations really of why things are the way they are. So the seeking for love is there because the feeling says I need love. The feeling says I need love because the feeling comes from a false idea of who I am. So this is why happiness for the human being, which is continuous unbroken peace of mind, is something available. Because our unhappiness is suffering, this feeling of uncomfortableness, which stems from a false idea, stems from an error. So once the error is corrected, the suffering ends. And when the suffering ends, what we find is what's there is the ground of our being, which is more than enough. Does anything else come up for you as a result of that?
Yeah, thank you. There is a question that did come up that doesn't seem very relevant, but I'll still ask. So the way we seek love, because that is a form of pleasure again that we are seeking. Any seeking, even the seeking of our true self, or that unbroken peace, is that again a pleasure that we are seeking? in some way.
Yeah, great. So this is very relevant, is that when we see the principle that is our unhappiness, and so seeking outcomes, seeking something out there, something in the future, is a principle movement. It's a basis of a movement that when we really start to become aware of it, we realize that is a form of our suffering. That way of relating to life is suffering. And so you're absolutely right. At some point we realize even seeking peace, seeking enlightenment, is in itself an obstacle. So if the spiritual concepts have become new beliefs, so the spiritual concepts can dissolve the old beliefs, so we might stop seeking love, we might stop seeking financial outcomes as our happiness, that's clicked. But what we might find has set in place is the belief that my happiness is to be found in perfecting spiritual seeking. Or my happiness will be available when enlightenment one day possibly happens. And so that seeking in itself becomes an obstacle again, because it will maintain the me that is seeking, the me that is unhappy now, the me that will be happy in the future. All of that is contained in that new belief that essentially has also become part of the belief in personal doership. It's just, the principle is the same, but the specific object that is sought has changed. But nonetheless, that's an inevitable and useful error that has to happen in this process. For some time we do become attached to seeking enlightenment or freedom, and that can be helpful at taking the place of the other pleasures that we were previously seeking. And at some point we'll realize from our own experience that this too is causing suffering, and then awareness will land on what will ask, the question will be asked, so I can feel this suffering, what's actually going on, and we might realize, wow, I've got this obsession with waiting and seeking for this idea that I have. And when awareness lands on that and sees that this has become a new belief and something new to seek, then it can fall away. And someone could say, well, if that falls away, then how am I going to find, what's going to drive me to continue to seek? And it's very ironic. Life is always very paradoxical and ironic. We find that this seeking is actually the obstacle. We seek because we think, obviously, if I'm looking for something, then the harder I seek, the more likely I am to find what I'm looking for. It turns out that life doesn't tend to work this way in a lot of situations, especially the spiritual seeking. The answers come when the seeking stops. And that's because there's something very unique about this search, and that's a search that's an error. We're searching something that we are. And so that's why the seeking actually is the end, when the seeking falls away, when the recognition is that there's nothing to seek, or that if I'm seeking even myself, which when we think about it is quite strange, that we're seeking ourself, that which we are. So when awareness starts landing on these nuances that start to show that the whole basis on which our thinking rests, that all of that logic doesn't apply for this particular search. So in a lot of non-dual teachings, instead of talking about the dynamics that I'm speaking about here, the approach is to cut off all of the thinking and say, that's your old way of thinking about it. Stop using your mind this way. And so whenever anyone asks a question, it's a very valid approach, very powerful approach to actually undermine the question instead of giving an answer to the question. So much so that it can push the brain into a state of not being able to go anywhere. Because each time the brain tries to create a question that it wants an answer to, the question is undermined as, no, that's not valid. It can push the brain to a place where it has nowhere to go. And that can create a snap into a field of awareness that is prior to thinking. So hopefully by presenting concepts, which gives the brain a whole lot of food for thought, there's very likely the chance that the brain can start turning all of these concepts into new objectives and new forms of obsessive thinking. But inherent in the concepts that are being presented are the hints that say, don't use it like this. Which is not really saying to an individual, don't do it. It's just saying, inevitably, the concepts will start to be related to incorrectly. But included in those concepts is a correction to that. So you ask a question like this. Really great, valid question that needs to be asked. The explanation is given. And so that becomes part of the teaching that eventually will cut off the incorrect interpretation and incorrect relationship to the concepts in teaching. And when I mentioned a different approach, a different non-dual approach, that's not to say that approach doesn't come with its shortcomings, doesn't come with potentials for the mind to grab onto those concepts and misinterpret them. All spiritual teachings will potentially be misinterpreted by the mind. The mind is very powerful. The belief in personal doership really is very powerful at hearing a concept and turning it into a belief. Whenever we turn a concept into a belief, we're a little deluded. And so traditional non-dual teachings can create all sorts of delusions that are temporary, and those teachings will also have a mechanism within them that eventually will point out the delusion that is happening. So we start off being deluded before we start seeking. A delusion about who we are, a mistake about who we are, the doer, and needing pleasure in order to be complete. And that delusion continues all the way through the seeking and grabs onto all of the concepts in the different teachings. And the process is of eventually the delusion mechanism getting weaker and weaker and weaker till it fades out. So if you see Buddha on the road, kill him. That's what that's basically relating to, or pointing at, that this search for enlightenment and even holding the teachings and the teacher as up, even that needs to be killed at some point. And we know when that point is, when we realize, wow, I've turned the teachings into a new objective. So biological versus psychological reactions. This is a very important aspect that I think needs to be described. Is this particular set of pointers points out that, in general, these pointers in general point out that whatever happens in each moment is not my doing and not your doing, but part of life unfolding. It suggests that life is a predetermined story, a creation of Source. Source at rest has become Source in movement. Source at rest has become the manifestation. And the manifestation is that which is arising in our experience right now, this is the manifestation, moment after moment after moment. And so what happens in the manifestation, even though it feels like I am in control of determining what happens, actually I am part of the creation. Everyone is part of the creation, just as if we are part of a dream at night, a night dream, all characters in the night dream, that the various characters in the night dream will say and do exactly what they're destined to do as a result of the storyline of that dream. The characters will feel like they are independent and in control of the words that are coming out of their mouth. If one character decides to chase after another character in the night dream, it will feel like that's his doing and that he is an independent entity, not connected to anything else. But from analyzing a dream, we can see that actually the characters are not separate from the dream environment, and that when the dream collapses, all the characters collapse with the dream, and that a character in the dream can't jump outside of the dream and have an independent existence somewhere else. So this is pointing at the fact that whatever happens in the dream is destined to happen exactly the way that the dream has been created to happen, and nothing can happen differently. So in this particular teaching, it's suggested that everything is happening according to God's will or the creation of Source, and God is, in this context, it's just a concept. God is not something out there looking in, but God or Source has become all of this. It's like a bundle of clay that has turned into a clay village, let's say. So God is the underlying principle of all of this, the energy, let's say, or the consciousness. And when I use clay, it's just an analogy. God is not a physical thing. It's consciousness, and when it turns into this, it means that the manifestation has arisen within inside consciousness as an imagination. So all of this is a very creative imagination in the mind of Source, created in such a way that from within the creation, it doesn't seem like that. It seems like an objective reality. Creates the feeling that I am this three-dimensional entity, separate, not connected to anything else, in control of everything I say and do. And so that's one way of describing, that's the more mystical explanation. The other way of demonstrating that whatever happens in each moment is not my doing but a happening is to look at the process of cause and effect and see that there's an initial impulse of energy, let's say the Big Bang, and then everything else is a ripple effect of that initial impulse. A bit like a bomb exploding. All the shrapnel of a bomb extends out from that starting point, and bits will bump into each other, they'll bump into walls and cars and people. And that whole movement of bits of shrapnel bouncing off walls and bouncing into other pieces of shrapnel, that's not something that is determined by the individual pieces. It's determined by the initial impulse. And when we look at the human being is actually a biological instrument by and large, made up of genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so what we do in each moment, the reaction that happens in each moment, is much less personal than we recognize. So if we start to see that the human being is a physical entity that has been designed a particular way, designed based on its genes and up-to-date conditioning, which is how life has impacted the genetic structure and added to it, moment after moment after moment. So in each moment, the human being is one way, the way they are. And when life presents itself, the human being and life basically react with each other. And that can be a harmonious reaction, or it can be a less harmonious reaction. So just like two chemicals that have a chemical composition that they weren't in control of, and the chemicals come together and there's going to be a reaction. And it's not personal. The reaction is based on the makeup of the chemicals at that point in time. Sometimes it's a harmonious reaction depending on what the chemical makeup is, and at other times it's an explosion. in practice, we also see that once we make a choice, which feels like my choice, based on the feeling of being the doer, the outcome is not in my control. Sometimes we get what we want and sometimes we don't get what we want. So there is the feeling of free will, but on investigation, both in theory and in practice, we're not in control. And so what that does is it demonstrates that the beliefs that are in place, the blame towards the other, the guilt towards ourself, is based on a surface feeling and taking the surface feeling to be reality. And as we investigate the mechanics of things deeper, we realize that what presents on the surface is not the full picture, which then means the beliefs in personal doership can fall away. The belief in personal doership falling away doesn't mean that the feeling of personal doership falls away, which is great news. Because in the end, what happens is we get to live as Sylvan, doing in each moment exactly what you think or feel you should do. Realizing that what you think or feel you should do is actually God's will. And recognizing that what Sylvan is a combination of a vehicle, the body-mind, through which Source is functioning. So the impersonal consciousness of Source is linked to that body and is creating the personal consciousness experience. So then, after this investigation has happened, we get to live as Sylvan doing, or as Roger, doing in each moment what I think or feel I should do. Understanding that whatever I think or feel I should do is part of the story of life. And also realizing that what I am, what Roger is a combination of the impersonal consciousness of Source that is linked to a particular vehicle and is functioning through that vehicle as a human being, the human being experience. And then the realization is every human being is essentially the same thing. A unique vehicle that the one Source has linked to. One Source is linked to all of the unique vehicles and is basically playing a game. So consciousness is speaking with consciousness on the grand level, we could say that there is the one consciousness functioning through Roger and the same one consciousness functioning through Sylvan. And that the one consciousness is having a conversation with with itself. Then when we come down in practice, we end up saying, no, Roger is speaking with Sylvan and Sylvan is listening, and then Sylvan speaks to Roger and Roger listens. But understanding that when we say Sylvan and Roger, what are we talking about? We're talking about a vehicle that has been specifically designed in order for this experience to happen, designed by Source, and now Source is functioning through all of the vehicles.
Just now, I'm just a little lost because I tried to focus just after you say that to focus where I am. You know. And the feeling.
Did you say where you are? Where you are?
Yes, where
Yeah.
I am. Yes.
So you're trying to find Sylvan, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very strange now. Yeah.
Mm.
And I try to have a support, to have something. Yeah.
So your experience is a bit disoriented?
Yeah.
Because you see, the experience has always been that there is a Sylvan, a very body-centered experience, that this is who I am. And these concepts being exposed to, not just these concepts, but most non-dual teachings, which are continually saying, actually, there is no Sylvan as you have known yourself or have imagined yourself. Then at some point, we can have some shifts that start to change the experience from being one where there is a very obvious sense that, well, of course there's a Sylvan. That's what the experience is saying. And then the experience sometimes changes to help us really experientially recognize, who am I? Where am I? Because the essence of the human being is actually formless awareness. The core of who we are is something that is not at all able to be located anywhere.
I feel the vision when you say the open gas
Mm-hmm.
like this.
Yeah. So if you feel a bit, sometimes people can get fearful in that state because it's like, well, I don't know who I am. Who we've lived as our whole life is very defined. I am a father, I am a brother, I am a accountant, I'm good at this, good at that, and I am this physical thing. That's also very, when things tend to open up a little bit, it can feel disorienting and sometimes some fear comes in. What we'll find is always present is the sense of existence, the sense I am, which is not I am something specific, just I am. And it's an undefined, like what is undefined. But the feeling of existence, something exists, is undeniable. So if I ask the question, are you dead? You don't have to think about the question and answer it from thought. You just know from the experience, well, no, I am. So if ever the experience becomes a little bit disorienting, for awareness to land on the isness, the existence aspect of the experience, can be quite grounding. And not only grounding, but it says, oh, there I am. You know, we tend to focus on the parts that we thought we were that have fallen away, the beliefs, let's say. The experience tends to open up, and then a lot of the aspects that I thought I was fall away. And what we tend sometimes, what awareness doesn't land on, is this very basic isness that is always present. And that's really the self being realized. The self, meaning the essence of the human being, is this very formless, impersonal sense of existence. This impersonal I amness.
Can you talk about a bit state of desirelessness?
Desirelessness.
Yeah.
Okay, yes.
I mean, I have heard one lecture by somebody on YouTube, and he says that it's a kind of before you get enlightened, you have to be in a state where you have to have no thoughts, at least for 48 minutes. That's what he says. If you can stay in a state, not waiting for anything to happen, and no thoughts are arising, it's kind of a only stay in I am. You stay in this state kind of 48 minutes, and it should happen.
Mm-hmm.
Is it true? I don't know.
Well, the problem is you'll be waiting for yourself to stay in that state for 48 minutes,
Yeah.
which in itself will be an obstacle to being in that state for 48 minutes. So it's useful to even drop that concept, which is not saying it's a bad concept. It's saying we have to be careful how we relate to these concepts. Because if we turn them into a belief, then that belief becomes the obstacle. I personally don't subscribe to, because it's not my experience. I didn't have to. I didn't. I wasn't ever told that 48 minutes is the magic number. But desirelessness is an interesting principle and very much worth talking about. In the Buddha's concept, when he boils it down to what enlightenment is, made it very simple. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. The cause of suffering is desire. And in this context, desire means something very specific. It means attachment to outcomes, attachment to pleasure. So what we started off speaking of, I'm not sure if you were here at the time, but what we were talking about is that the core of this teaching says that there is a deep ingrained set of beliefs. I am the doer, the other is the doer, and my happiness is to be found in outcomes. When we believe that my happiness, my completeness, my wholeness is to be found in outcomes, that essentially means that my life depends on it. My life depends on outcomes, on pleasure. And when that's our belief, we have to be attached to pleasure and outcomes. Attached means I believe that I need that in order to be complete, like it's my lifeblood. Renunciation practice is there in order for us to come to realize that that's not true. So the Buddhist monk will shave his head, put on very ordinary clothing, eat ordinary food, sleep on a hard bed, have cold showers, no sex. So all of these pleasures in life are taken away in order to demonstrate something. And so one day, after years of not having the ordinary pleasures, the monk might be walking in the forest and the sun shining through the trees and everything's perfect, you know, and in that moment, nothing is needed. And the monk might have this realization, I am. Even with my shaved head and no fancy clothes, simple food, hard bed, cold showers, no sex. I am, like right now, I'm complete. And so once that has been realized, not maybe just once is not enough, because these realizations can happen and then everything is crystal clear in that moment of insight, and then half an hour later it seems a bit foggy, and a day later we sort of have some idea that something profound happened. We might even remember what happened, but we see our behavior is quite different to what that realization was showing. So we can see that we're still attached. So it might not happen in one sitting. It might take an extended period of time, but once the realization is deeply ingrained, which means that the belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes has been eradicated, then actually the renunciation can end. So the monk can then grow his hair again, put on normal clothes, go out and have relationship, eat good food. Now the relationship to the pleasures in life is going to be very different now. Very different to what it was before. Before it was, I need this in order to be whole. I need it to survive, essentially, to be complete. Now with the realization, the monk knows, I am complete, and that life is going to be a flow of pleasure and pain, and that I can't control that, and I don't need to control it. I get to enjoy the pleasure when pleasure is there, and when pain is there, then I have to endure the pain, knowing that the pain is not an attack on who I am, in essence, and the pleasure is not an addition to who I am, in essence. That pleasure and pain is on a specific level, on the surface level, which doesn't make it insignificant. The pleasure is still wonderful, and the pain is something that, well, according to biological preference, would be better if it wasn't there. But now the attitude is not going to be one of resisting and grasping after pleasure and resisting pain. And so once we've seen this, then what we find is a whole lot of thinking that had to be there before we realize this can stop. The thinking before we realize this was thinking about how we're going to set up our business and how we're going to grow our business in the next 5 years, and then after that the next 10 years, in order for it to be the empire that we think we need in order to be happy. And now that sort of obsessive thinking will fall away. It doesn't mean that we won't plan, and we can still have a business and we can still do business planning. But we'll do business planning when it seems appropriate, knowing that I have to do what I can do, and once I've done it, then I can stop thinking about it. Whereas beforehand, the thinking would be going on all the time. And if it's not thinking about expectations in the future, it was thinking about regrets in the past. Regrets based on things that turned out to be painful instead of pleasurable, where we still believe that that outcome was our happiness. And so once we see that actually I am, and I was back then even when things didn't work out, then all of this obsessive thinking about the past and the future can fall away. And so that is the equivalent of 48 minutes of no thinking. The idea that all thinking stops in life is a mistake, because there is two parts to the brain, the working mind and the thinking mind. All of the obsessive thinking about pleasure and desire, which is our attachment to pleasure, and doership, I'm the doer, you're the doer, I hate you for what you did that hurt me, I hate myself for what I did that hurt those that I love. All of that's part of the thinking mind. And that can collapse once the false beliefs that are in the system, once they get dissolved, then the thinking mind effectively collapses. And that would be what is referred to as no mind. Really, it's no thinking mind. It's the thinking mind that is the suffering that gets in the way of our peace. And it's the thinking mind that gets in the way of a recognition of what we are in essence. And so once that recognition has happened, thinking can come back. Like my speaking at the moment is effectively thought turned into words. And whenever we go to the shop and we look at different foods and compare labels and what have you, that's thinking. When we order a taxi to pick us up at a certain time to get us to the airport, decide how much money we need to take on holiday, all of that is thinking. It's the thinking of the working mind. It's functional thinking. It's very important for life to carry on. And so to expect all thinking to stop is to have a false expectation of what we're actually looking for. Along the way, there are going to be very profound realizations and moments that will happen where thinking altogether can stop. But those realizations are exactly that. They're experiences that allow us to see things through the realization. And they're not examples of what life will one day be lived as 24/7 for the rest of our life. That also is a mistake when we have profound realizations, profound experiences that match very much the non-dual teachings, that say it's all about oneness, and then we can turn that experience that has faded away into an expectation, something that we're waiting for it to come back. And so here we're making it very clear, what are we really looking for? So this is the beginning question that we need to ask and have a clear answer to. What are we, as humans, what are we really looking for? And the answer that's given is actually what we're looking for is something very ordinary and simple. It's not, what we're going to get at the end is not some great gift from God that is going to give us a lot more than we currently have. The angels aren't going to suddenly come down and start singing, and we're not going to be in a state of eternal bliss, which is one of the things that is often suggested based on how some of the Vedic texts have been translated. What we're going to find is that we'll have the absence of something, the absence of suffering. And the absence of suffering delivers peace of mind. So if we're clear when we ask this question, what am I looking for? actually I'm looking for the end of suffering. The end of suffering is simply peace of mind. So if we keep that clearly in mind, when we go through our day and find ourselves seeking certain things and feeling uncomfortable, awareness might land on the fact, oh wow, in my belief pattern here, in this moment, I'm seeking something much more than peace of mind. And then that realization, that thought can cut off the seeking. Say, no, I'm actually just seeking peace of mind. And peace of mind is the absence of thinking of this very nature that was happening seconds before, even thinking about the spiritual search. Thinking that I'm waiting for 48 minutes of no thought, for example. Which, and this, don't get me wrong, this is not a criticism of that teaching, because what I'm saying is just it's a set of concepts, it's a teaching, it's not the truth.
I just wanted to know that is it true or not? Nothing to, I'm not identifying with his words.
Yeah. So I don't think that the 48 minutes is something that I would say is true, and I don't think that a teacher would say it's true either. It's a concept, it's a spiritual. One of the things we realize is there is no truth, actually.
In past, I'm following the Eckhart Tolle from 3 years, and I have experienced profound peace whenever I'm sitting and focusing on the inner body.
Mm-hmm.
But after, I think 6 months have passed, I have not experienced that peace again.
Mm-hmm.
The reason is the seeker is appearing again and again. It's trying to catch hold of some, what do you say, same kind of experience which I had.
Yeah.
So how to stop that? How can I drop that?
You just realized it. You just explained it. You just explained the mechanism that is happening, and seeing that by...
Yesterday what was happening, like I was sitting, I tried to go within the body, focus on whatever the sensations I could feel, and I was also focusing on the sense of I am, the sense of existence. So after some time, whenever I'll drop it after 15 or 20 minutes, let's say 30 minutes, then what is going to happen, kind of unease will be generated by the thoughts, and I will start seeking. I will try to look something through the YouTube, finding out some WWE or some songs and these kind of things. So I want to completely drop all of that. I just want to sit effortlessly in this moment.
Yeah, I would even drop that as a expectation, because the fact is we can't live life sitting effortlessly in every moment. We can, it depends what your definition of sitting effortlessly is. If you want to sit effortlessly like it was 6 months ago, that's holding on to an experience. You had an experience which was an experience of profound peace, and that's not necessarily what is available on a continuous, unbroken basis. But your mind has registered, based on having the experience, that this is it.
It's comparing the things.
Yeah. What if that's not it? What if that was a profound experience of peace, but not what happiness in daily living will look like? So if that's the case, what's happening is you've now attached to that experience and turning it into an expectation in the future, and that's the very principle of suffering. So how suffering will stop is when something within your system registers this, and there's an understanding that even trying to stop that becomes more resistance. So it's only when something registers it as being a mistake, let's say, and it just stops on its own. And how that happens is by life putting us into certain situations that reconditions us. Because the thinking is, the relationship you're describing is based on your current up-to-date conditioning. That current up-to-date conditioning includes the profound experience you had and the way your brain related to that experience. So there's certain up-to-date conditioning in place that is has this as an expectation, And then life will bring about new conditioning. So this discussion, let's say, is new conditioning. How it affects the old conditioning is not in your control or my control, but it could quite possibly affect the old conditioning in such a way that it changes something. Changes something, and you realize in the next week that the insisting on life being a certain way, life being like it was 6 months ago, has fallen away. And then we'll find, oh, there's a peace now. This relationship to life as it is, without insisting that it's different, is actually the peace I'm looking for. So it's much simpler than we think, because those profound experiences, by the fact that they're profound experiences, are less simple in a sense. They're more complex. There's more aspects to the experience, than rather than just dropping any expectation of how life should be, and just being at peace with it right now, which really means we have to, in our head, come to the fact that enlightened living may look much, much simpler and much, much more ordinary than we've been led to believe based on certain things that we've read. You know that when you read certain things, I came across one of the things that really got me hooked is a line that said, your true nature is brighter than 1,000,000 suns. I thought, wow, I've got to know this is what I am, and I have no clue about it because I've never known myself as something brighter than 1,000,000 suns. Now, in a way, I can relate to what it's pointing at, but it's not literal. It's not meant to be taken literally. And so you hear many people that have had these realizations say that actually it's very ordinary. It's extraordinary because of what it delivers. It delivers what we've really been looking for, which is the end of suffering. But that end of suffering is really quite an ordinary state. And this is the paradox again. So could it be that what we're seeking is completely ordinary living, doing in each moment exactly what we need to do, cooking dinner, answering the door, going to work, having to navigate traffic, but finding we do all of that without the previous internal resistance that was happening, without that happening?
Is it possible that we can constantly doing the same work like 24 hours and not creating resistance towards it? 24 hours or 48 hours or constantly, let's say for 1 week, if you have to do some work, so I have to read some research papers. I cannot keep on reading them like for 6 hours or 10 hours. I have to think about them. I have to kind of generate imagination what's written in here, try to understand that. Can I do it for like 24 hours? Is it possible? Such a thing is possible? I don't know.
As a special power, you mean? Focusing on something
not
for...
special power. I mean, since we drop the resistance, if resistance towards what is absent,
Yep.
it means you can constantly do what you are doing.
No. Yeah, I mean, so are we recording again? Should we be using the microphone?
Yes.
Yeah. So the thing is that we dropped a resistance to what is, but what is functioning in life is the biological entity, and the biological entity still has limitations. It has its genes and up-to-date conditioning. That's what it is, and within that, it has its biological preferences, which means it's going to get biologically tired, and a non-resistance to what is means that when there is tiredness, the body will sleep. And so we actually find that this understanding might even make us much less capable of working long stretches of time, because we worked long stretches of time when we felt that the outcome was very imperative to my existence. And now we've dropped this belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, specific outcomes, and so we might not push ourselves to do something that biologically doesn't make that much sense. But having said that, what I've found is that we'll work much more efficiently and life will flow much more efficiently because we're not setting up a whole lot of expectations, and then the body gets to function according to its own intelligence. And actually the body is highly intelligent and highly in tune with life. And so an unexplained efficiency kicks in even once we have dropped our insistence and planning of life. Something that the brain doesn't understand. It thinks, well, if I just let things unfold as they're going to unfold, then yeah, that might work on one level, but I'm not going to be very productive. And that's not how it turns out.
When you
Just
talk,
check it's on. Yeah.
when you talk about stopping the resistance to pain, or giving in to feeling pain, I can read into it in two different ways. Like on one hand, I think that would be just like giving in to the full expression of the emotion. So like if we stop the resistance to pain in any of its forms, then if I feel anger, I should just let it be there to its full extent. But I find that if I stop, like if I identify that anger and I stop at that moment, and I kind of try to tap a little bit into the concepts, or into a different way of me relating to that anger, I understand it from a different perspective, and that usually turns into compassion, for example, or other feelings. But in a way that is resistance, because I'm kind of putting a stop to the emotion, and I'm putting ideas in of what I know as new concepts, and then what I'm reacting to is that. So there's like a mitigation of like the feeling that's coming.
Yeah. So just to clarify that not resisting pain is on an attitudinal level, where we realize that pleasure and pain are inevitable flows of life. And so attitudinally, we understand that pain is going to have its time and its place. Biologically, we'll still resist pain because the biology is still there, and it needs to, in certain situations, resist pain for survival. So if someone is threatening us with a knife, then we don't know how we're going to act, but even with this attitude that understands that pleasure and pain is part of the flow of life, it could be that we'll either run away, which means on one level someone will say, well, you're not accepting the pain of being threatened because you're not just standing there. So we'll either run away, or we'll freeze, or we'll fight back. And so the fighting back is not a attitudinal resistance to the pain in the moment. That's a biological resistance. And that's not suffering, that biological resistance. So on an attitudinal level, when someone attacks us, let's say with a knife, which is a very unfortunate situation, and let's say they cut our arm and we're in hospital, it will be seen that was destiny unfolding, my destiny to have my arm cut. I might have biologically resisted, which could be pain in the moment, that the cut it was pain in the moment, and then understood that they were doing exactly as they were destined to do. And so the story after the event won't be there. Now, coming back to specifically what you were talking about, is that there needs to be a distinction between anger, which is a biological reaction in the moment, and blame. Blame is the psychological reaction based on the belief in personal doership. And so when we feel blame arising, it's wise for us to realize that this blame is based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning, which includes a psychological component of the up-to-date conditioning, meaning it includes the false idea of who I am. And if we don't resist that blame, means we don't blame ourselves for blaming, then that's a layer of peace that won't be there if we blame ourselves for blaming. So that's very important, to just allow the blame to come up without resisting it. What you're talking about, I believe, is the step further on from that, which stems from an understanding that I'm not the doer and the other isn't the doer. And so blame can arise, and either after it arises or just before it arises, the thought kicks in and says, am I in the... So this might not be how the thought kicks in for you, but it would be the same principle. Based on some insight and understanding, based on your observation of life, the thought might arise, actually this blame is based on a belief in personal doership. And that is the intellectual understanding of the concepts based on your own investigation, which means it's not just an intellectual understanding, it's gone deeper and deeper. It's effectively the arising of that wisdom in the moment, cutting off the blame, which is exactly what this understanding will eventually do. First, we allow the blame to be there because we understand it has to be there. And then as our understanding goes deeper and deeper, then we see the blame no longer has to be there because this thought is arising and cutting off the blame. And so that is not your doing. That's not you resisting the flow of life. That's your genes and up-to-date conditioning automatically kicking in and cutting off the blame. And so if we see this happening, we understand that, wow, the understanding is going deeper and deeper and deeper, and it's working automatically to cut off blame. And so this is how the understanding goes deeper. It starts off as an intellectual understanding. As life unfolds day after day, moment after moment, we observe life, and our intellectual understanding gets confirmed and seen, and that means that it goes deeper and deeper, becomes much more than just an intellectual understanding. And then it's that deep understanding that starts cutting off suffering quicker and quicker and quicker than it used to. So we maybe found that suffering used to last for an hour, and now at some point the understanding kicks in after half an hour. And then as the understanding goes deeper, we find that it kicks in after 5 minutes. And as it goes in deeper still, then it might kick in after 1 minute, and then after 10 seconds, then after 1 second. And eventually it's so deep that the suffering, the blame, doesn't even arise. So no, that's not a resistance of what is. It is actually what is happening.
Sometimes I can see the conditioning that led to, let's say, painful events, for example. But even if I can see the conditioning, I still feel that I'm the doer, so I feel guilty.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if it's because I haven't seen enough conditioning. So this is for the painful events, and for the more pleasure events, the opposite.
Sure.
I don't feel the doer, but I don't see the conditioning.
Yeah. So the the opposite of guilt is pride, where things happen through us that deliver positive outcomes, and we claim we are the doers of that. So what you just described might not be an intense version of that. You're just saying that there are positive outcomes and you don't see the conditioning.
Yes.
Which really means that...
It's like if it happened, and I don't even feel pride, it's just like joy and peace. It's just like, oh, I'm just astonished.
Astonished, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but so in both cases, when we don't see the conditioning, what it means is that the sense of me being the doer has more chance to be there. So the positive outcome means that, well, it was your doing. If you don't see that it was a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. And it may not create pride. You might just be at peace in that particular situation. But what it means is that the identity based on these beliefs is in place, ready to be triggered by life. To be triggered, to be activated, activated by life. And so the purpose of any teaching is to dissolve this identity that is going to be activated by the flow of life. And in this particular set of pointings, the identity is dissolved by pointing out that actually there is only a biological entity that functions in the flow of life. And the belief in personal doership is a belief that doesn't recognize that. Doesn't recognize that there's just a biological movement in each moment. The belief in personal doership effectively creates this imaginary person with free will. Whereas when we really look at it, there is no person with free will. There's just a movement in life. A body that is designed a particular way and has to perform the way it performs in each moment. So this body in this moment has to perform this way, and the outcome is either good or bad. And if I don't recognize that, then I will claim ownership over the good outcomes, my doing, and claim ownership over those that deliver bad outcomes, my doing also. That identity that claims ownership is the problem in life. So what you described, the first part is easier to deal with, really, because that's where you're saying there's, you can see that what happens is based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning, and yet guilt still happens. So the reason guilt still happens is because it hasn't been seen that what happens is only based on these two factors. Because these two factors, genes and up-to-date conditioning, were never in your control. The genes were not, you didn't choose them. And the up-to-date conditioning is basically how life has impacted you moment after moment after moment. Not something you were in control of. So this is new conditioning, for example. And you're not in control of what happens in this environment. So we find ourselves in an environment, but then we're not in control of what happens in the environment, which is effectively our new conditioning in each moment that affects our up-to-date conditioning. So when we really see that what I am is based on these two factors only, which means what happens, sometimes what happens is a bad outcome, is really not my doing. And then guilt can't arise. So if guilt still arises, we have to just conclude, why is guilt still arising? And the answer is because it's not fully seen that what happens through me is based on these two factors, genes and up-to-date, and I'm not in control of either of them. And so this is not, recognizing that is not a problem. It's not, we shouldn't recognize it to feel self-critical. It's just recognizing it to understand that that's the mechanics. If guilt is still there, it's because the genes and up-to-date conditioning being the factors that lead to the outcomes hasn't been seen to be the only two factors. And why isn't that seen? And the answer is simple, is that life, as it's impacted us moment after moment back in time, in history, has included events that are very painful. And those events that were very painful were related to by the sense of personal doership, and certain emotions that weren't able to be expressed fully at that time were locked away. So let's say the event was of your brother or sister really doing something cruel to you when you were a child. The event at that time was very painful. It penetrated down to the core of who we believed we were. So we weren't receiving love from our brother or sister, we were receiving the opposite. we took that, so that was pain in the moment. We took that as an attack on who I am. You hurt me, I hate you. And that gets locked away. And so what's locked away based on the past is these beliefs in personal doership. Beliefs that don't see that what your brother or sister was doing was based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so even if we understand on our conscious level that whatever's happening through me is based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning, on a much deeper level there are still these ingrained energies that say the opposite. Ingrained energies from the past. And so then life comes and impacts us again. So either we feel guilt about those things in the past, well, in this case we'd feel blame and hatred. And if it was a memory about something we did that hurt our brother or sister, let's say, then we'll remember that event with the same belief in personal doership, but now with a hatred for ourselves, guilt. And that's locked away in our system. And so eventually this process is a process of the conscious understanding, going deeper and deeper, and uprooting more and more of the ingrained beliefs. And as those start coming out, and they start coming out in the form of emotional release, let's say, remembering past events and going through a therapeutic process, which is not something that really needs to be specifically spoken about because it will happen on its own. You'll find yourself in certain workshops, if need be, Tantra workshop or mindfulness workshop, and that will unfold and come out as it needs to. And that is the process of these deeply ingrained beliefs leaving the system. And once all of those have left the system, then we find that from top to bottom, we completely see that whatever happens is what is destined to happen, not my doing, not the other's doing, and then the guilt doesn't arise. But if you still have some question around that, if it's not clear.
What is the importance of all these kind of experiences arising, good or bad? Like you were describing in her experience, something painful done by the brother or sister, and they also did something good. I mean, I'm asking on a cosmic level, what is the significance of all it?
I'm not sure I would say that it was a happening as part of the story, the cosmic story, let's say. And so the significance is that it was always destined to be part of the story, and it happened. So that was the significance. It had to happen, so it happened. Then we can go down a level and say, so what is the significance of it happening? Why was it there that it had to happen? And we could say, well, it could be there in order to create a deeper mistake about who we are, based on how we react to the situation. And that was also destined to happen in order for suffering to happen. So the story of life can be seen to be this is just an explanation, it's not the truth, but it can be seen that it's a story of time and evolution. There is biological evolution, industrial evolution, technological evolution, spiritual evolution. And then within that story of evolution, there is a forgetting of oneself, and therefore suffering. And at some point a remembering happens in the story, a realization of what we really are, and then suffering ending. So in this situation, the event was part of the forgetting and the suffering process.
One more question. Whenever I'm trying to sit in the I am, the sense of existence, mind arises and it says how long I have to stay like this. And I may not follow it in this moment. Maybe after 10 minutes it will again arise, it will say the same thing. I will follow then. then eventually it leads to suffering, seeking and suffering.
Because what's happened is that we have turned sitting into I am into a practice. And it's the doer that has turned it into a practice. So the sense of personal doership has said, if I can sit in I am for long enough, then at some point that will deliver an outcome. And then we become, we effectively sit in I am as a practice. And when we practice meditation strictly, that's actually a basic meditation practice. Eventually, meditation practice is to realize that it brings us to letting, where the meditator falls away. And then you find meditation happening and no insistence of how it happens or how it looks. And the funny thing is that with no insistence of how it happens and how it looks tends to lead to a deeper meditation happening. But in practice then, when I say in practice, in daily living, we'll then meditate when we feel like meditating, because we enjoy it, rather than meditating because I have to meditate to try and get somewhere. And so the same, once again, these are just realizing the same principles of where principles of suffering have entered into our spiritual seeking. And as soon as we see it, it's great, because it's like, oh, I have to stop doing that. Not I have to as a rule, I have to. It's a realization that if this keeps going on, it's an obstacle. And so the realization of the working mind that sees the problem that's happening in the thinking mind brings the habit to an end. And it's not a forcible thing. It's just an obvious, we want to. Now, once it's seen to not be helpful, then it can stop. So with the practice of I am, how I suggest we do it is, one, realize that the center of consciousness really wants to abide in its home, which is the heart, and it's been dragged up into the head for a long time. And we think that that's the normal place, and in fact it keeps going back up into the head. So the first part of abiding in I am for me is to visualize the center of consciousness dropping down into the heart. At the same time, open up our gaze, which means we're not looking at any object in particular, but realizing that there are all of these objects. The whole landscape fits into my field of awareness. So peripheral vision, we can move around from looking at one object to the next, but while I'm looking at the light, I can see the TV is there, and the wall is there, and the curtains are there. And then as I focus on another object, all the other objects are they're still there in the field of vision. So opening up our gaze, so it's a soft gaze, allowing everything to be exactly the way it is. And now having understood, at least intellectually and from our own experience, that our suffering is all of this obsessive thinking about the past and the future, expectations in the future based on outcomes we think we need, regrets in the past based on things we did that didn't deliver positive outcomes, and blaming ourselves, feeling regret, blaming the others for what they did. So once we see that this thinking of the mind is not actually delivering us anything beneficial, we thought it was, that's why it keeps happening. We thought there's some benefit in blaming ourselves for what happened in the past. We think there's some benefit in obsessively trying to control life so that we get the... And so now the practice is the thought I am arises when awareness lands on this obsessive thinking. And the thought I am is a thought that becomes the bookend for that thinking. So it creates a cut. It creates a cut because there's this realization in the moment, this is not helpful, this obsessive thinking. And at the same time as it creates that cut, then we can drop into the heart with the open gaze. And we might find that we can sit in I am at first, so you've obviously been doing this for a while, so it might not be the case, but when we first started, we might find we sit in I am for half a second. And then it seems boring or something. It's like, what's the point of this? And the obsessive thinking drags the center of consciousness back into the head, and we find ourselves carrying on with our planning for the future, which the mind seems to think is much more beneficial. That's why it says, well, what's the point of sitting in the heart? And it might take 10 minutes before we realize that this is happening again. And that's okay, because once we realize it, then the thought I am can arise again and cut off the obsessive thinking, and we drop back into the heart. And once again, we might only be there for half a second or a second, go back into thinking. And this is perfectly understandable, and each time that awareness lands on the fact that obsessive thinking is again, the thought I am cuts it off. And this can happen 20, 30, 40, 50 times in a day, because we don't need to sit quietly. We can just do this as we're walking through our life. And as that happens more and more often, then this movement from head to heart becomes more and more understood and more strong. And we find that this resting in being can increase in duration from half a second to 5 seconds to a minute to 2 minutes. But we're not actually waiting for it to get to 30 minutes or an extended period of time. It's simply about understanding that there is this place of being, which is our true essence, and continually coming back to that when awareness lands on the fact that thinking has hijacked the show. Without an expectation of how long we stay there, knowing that it's destiny, whether we stay there half a second or 3 minutes. And allowing it to be as we are, with the understanding that whenever we remember, go back there. And that effortless movement, which means you don't practice I am just happens. The thought I am comes up, cuts off the obsessive thinking. Every time awareness lands on the fact obsessive thinking is happening. And then, without having turned it into a great extensive practice, because sometimes we're not going to be able to drop into I am, just the thinking is going to be too obsessive, and the thought I am comes up and nothing happens. And if we keep insisting I am, it's not a mantra, I am. It's just something that needs to just come up automatically, because this explanation or an understanding of yourself has sunk into the body. And so the I am happens automatically. There'll be times when it doesn't cut off the obsessive thinking, and we have to surrender to the fact that this is not a technique, this is not a magic solution. And at some point we'll find, I get to rest in being. It's where the home is, and it's effortless. We don't need to force it to be there. And then we realize, it's delivered.
So you can't possibly avoid blame if you walk into your partner cheating on you. You highly evolved people spiritually, maybe their suffering from a day would go to an hour and lesser, but the blame and the attachment to the outcome, because you don't want your partner cheating on you, wouldn't totally go, right?
Depends on the understanding. If the understanding is total, the blame will totally go, because the blame is based on this misunderstanding of who we are and who the other is. Blame is saying what you have done is an attack on who I am. What you have done is something that you shouldn't have done and you could do differently. So the understanding is the complete opposite of that. The understanding is a realization that the flow of life is not something that determines whether I'm complete or not complete. And we know this from our own being. Now, when we rest in who we are at our core, it's not just a concept that says my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. It becomes experientially known. And that means that we go through life and life delivers pain. And if we can rest in being, we find that our beingness, our completeness isn't disturbed even by pain being presented in the moment. So it becomes not just a belief, but a standpoint from which life is lived. Not a mental standpoint, but a standpoint of being. And so someone cheating on you is effectively the same principle. It's a painful situation in the flow of life. So you're absolutely right. It doesn't mean that it won't be felt as painful, because the biological preferences and the emotional preferences, is for that not to happen. And so that can create pain in the moment. It will create pain in the moment. And that there will be a consequence to that. So the person who understands that that is not their happiness or unhappiness, but it is their pain, may still find that it's destiny for them to end the relationship. So that consequence, how that person will, or what happens from that point on in terms of the relationship, is determined by the story of life. So they may end the relationship or they may not end the relationship. The pain will be there to whatever extent it's destined to be there, based on the biological preference of that person for their partner not to be cheating, for example. But that pain doesn't mean that blame has to arise. In fact, they're two different things. There's pain, and then there's our attachment to pain, or our attachment to pleasure. And that will determine the blame part. And so, yes, in theory and in practice, I speak from experience, that this suffering component can end completely, which doesn't make us inhuman. In fact, far from it. It means that we get to relate to the other in a different way than before. And before, I found that you're sort of relating to the other in terms of what you can get out of them, because of what you think you need from them. And then the other is effectively a competitor in principle, or an enemy in principle, because at any moment they can take away or not deliver what you think you need from them. So we see this in relationship. If a partner, doesn't give what the other wants in the relationship, then there is a lot of resentment that happens in the relationship, because the basis of the relationship is, what can you give me? What do I need from you? And so if that falls away, then you can imagine you have a different basis for the relationship. And I understand, so what you're saying is absolutely right. The blame can't not happen if certain beliefs about who we are in place. But if those beliefs have dissolved, then the blame can't happen. So what we think is something that we have to work really hard at doing, not blaming the other, is not something we have to work hard on. It's something that actually happens effortlessly, because the beliefs on which the blame used to arise have dissolved. Are you convinced? So, if there's no other questions, do you have anything to add, Dipali?
No, I think I should give others a chance.
Well, everyone's... You have a chance if you'd like to say anything. You're welcome. If not, there's always tomorrow.
Well, I did have a question.
Yeah, sure.
Yesterday, we've spoken about this before many times, but I still want to understand it deeper. How do I connect free will with personal doership? Because it's conflicting for me even now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I understand that I'm not the doer, and at the same time, I have free will. So I want to understand that more.
So at first, we need to drop the idea of free will, because the idea of free will is so heavily linked with the idea of being the doer. So the first part is to come to the realization, I have no free will. Everything is happening exactly as it's destined to happen. And it's happening based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning, which I wasn't in control of. And therefore, the choices that I make are not really my choices. The choices I make in each moment are based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning. Or if we want to look at it in a more esoteric way, that the choices I make are based on what is destined to happen, so God's will in each moment. And so at first when we really see that, the first standpoint is, oh, I have no free will. Right? Everything is predetermined. Then the introduction of the fact that we have free will is a deeper nuance. It's a fine-tuning of seeing life as it is. So we've seen that what I thought I was as the doer, in control of everything, completely in control, we've seen that's an illusion, that's not true. And we've come to the conclusion everything is a happening according to God's will. And then a teaching says, yeah, well, it's not quite as simple as that, because you're missing something in the experience. In the experience, even though the experience isn't a reflection of the background truth, we can't deny that in the experience there is the feeling that you are free to do whatever you want in each moment. And so the free will that we're talking about is just a feeling, an illusion, let's say, a feeling of free will. And so we'll say that in each moment we have the feeling of free will, but we realize that that feeling of free will doesn't mean that it's actually my independent free will. It's God's will unfolding in such a way that it feels like my free will. And so if we have a very specific definition of what my free will is as a feeling, not implying that I have autonomy, but a feeling, then we find that we have two concepts that become very complementary. We realize that my feeling of free will is actually God's will. So God's will and free will become not opposites, they're one and the same thing, which then means that I can live life in each moment doing exactly what I think or feel I should do. That's my free will. But realizing that that free will is God's will. Which really means then that I feeling guilt when that deep realization happens. So this can't just be a belief that we take on because of concepts. This has to be something that we really investigate for ourselves, meaning we really need to come to see how life is unfolding moment after moment. And as we see life unfolding moment after moment as a happening and not my doing, time and time again, this conviction that what happens through me in each moment is not my doing, that goes deeper and deeper. And then we see my free will, my feeling of free will is actually God's will, which then means I get to live my life in each moment doing what I feel like or think, what I feel or think I should do. And regardless of the outcome, pleasure or pain, I know that it's not something that I had ultimate control over, which then means the guilt falls away, and especially the blame towards the other falls away, because we see that the other is exactly the same as me, an instrument through which God's will is unfolding. And even though they feel, they have the feeling of free will, which may well and truly obscure their understanding that everything is God's will, we still see the other as an, even if they don't see themselves that way, we see them as an instrument through which God's will is happening. Which means we see ourselves as an instrument, we see the other as an instrument, which means no guilt and no blame, no pride. And similarly, no expectation, understanding that my happiness is not to be found in pleasure.
Yeah, so just to add to the same thing, let's take an example, aggression. Now, if aggression is part of the genes and up-to-date conditioning, and I'm not the doer, then there's no problem. I can do what I want.
You can do what you want.
I'm not the doer.
Yeah, but if you use that as an excuse.
I'm not.
No.
I'm just taking an extreme example.
Yeah, so when aggression happens, with the understanding that actually this is a happening, so not just a concept that says I'm not the doer, but really clearly understanding that someone did something, Someone acted a certain way, and this rage just arose in you.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't choose to have this rage.
No.
It just flooded your system. And it flooded your system in such a way that the body moved because of this intense force. Or the words came out because of this intense force. So as you recognize this, as awareness lands on this and says, I didn't choose for this immense force to just overcome me, this rage to overcome me. That happened. And the words came out. And I didn't, in hindsight, I look at the words that came out, and I didn't mean those words to come out. I didn't want to hurt my friend, or even a stranger for that matter. And I see that the words that came out were quite, vitriolic. But that's what came out. And so if we really understand this time and time again, then that's when a compassion for ourselves actually happens. We're not trying to defend ourselves to the other and say, well, I'm not the doer. This is just a realization that comes. And then there's a compassion to ourselves and allowing this to happen, not where we just allow it and things get worse. Actually, the allowing of it will do the opposite, probably, is it will bring understanding to the situation. And usually this aggression comes because there's the deep sense of personal doership at the bottom of it. So by bringing in this understanding that I'm not the doer on this level, it then means that understanding can go deeper and deeper, to the point where it eventually will uproot the doership that is the cause of the aggression happening.
Yeah. Okay.
So, thank you everyone.